When I look back on that spring, I can hardly believe how one small decision altered the course of my family's life. My name is Linda Parker, and I live in a quiet town in Oregon with my husband Michael and our 21-year-old son, Ethan. We always thought of ourselves as a typical American family, hardworking, a little imperfect, but close-knit in our own ways. Michael worked as an accountant, often spending long hours buried in numbers, while I had spent most of my life teaching at the local elementary school before stepping back to focus more on home. Ethan was in college, majoring in fine arts, and though we didn't always understand his world of paintbrushes and sketches, we supported him with all our hearts. That was why, when Ethan came to me one afternoon and asked if I'd be willing to model for his art project, I said yes without hesitation. He explained that it wasn't anything unusual. His professor had assigned a study of human expression and form, and while many students hired models or asked friends, he thought it would be meaningful to capture someone he knew so well. I laughed, teasing him about all the glamorous choices he must have had. But deep down, I felt touched that he wanted me to be part of his work. I didn't know then what that yes would bring into our lives. At first, it was innocent enough. Ethan set up his small studio in the garage with canvases, leaning against the walls, jars of brushes on an old wooden table, and the faint smell of paint lingering in the air. He asked me to sit on a chair by the window, where the light streamed in just right. I wore my usual clothes, nothing dramatic, just a sweater and jeans. My hair tied back the way I often wore it at home. He studied my face with a seriousness that surprised me, sketching with swift, focused movements. As the days went by, our sessions became a routine. Every afternoon after his classes, he'd set up his easel, and I'd sit for an hour while he painted. Sometimes he'd ask me to tilt my chin slightly, or soften my gaze, or think of a memory that brought a certain emotion. It was strange at first, being observed so closely, but there was also something peaceful about it. For years, I had been a mother, a wife, a teacher, always in motion, always doing something for someone else. But in those moments, I was simply still. I was seen. Michael, on the other hand, barely noticed. He was consumed with work, often coming home late, eating dinner quickly, and retreating to his office to prepare for another day. I tried to tell him about Ethan's project, about how meaningful it felt to be part of it. But he would nod up absently and change the subject to taxes or deadlines. I told myself not to mind. He had always been practical, not artistic, and I couldn't expect him to understand. Still, a quiet ache grew in me when I tried to ignore. As Ethan's painting progressed, I began to notice small shifts in myself. I started caring more about how I looked when I sat in that chair. I would brush my hair more carefully, apply a little lipstick, even choose a nicer blouse. I told myself it was for the art that I wanted to give Ethan something beautiful to capture. But beneath that excuse was a deeper truth I didn't want to face. For the first time in years, I felt like someone was really paying attention to me. Not as a mother who cooked and cleaned, not as a wife who kept the household running, but as a woman with thoughts and feelings worth noticing. And then came the moment that changed everything. One afternoon, after weeks of painting, Ethan turned his canvas toward me so I could see the result. I expected a simple portrait, maybe a likeness of my face. What I saw instead took my breath away. He hadn't painted me as the tired woman I felt I had become. He painted me radiant, almost glowing, with eyes full of life and strength. The woman on the canvas looked younger, braver, more beautiful than I had allowed myself to believe I could be. Tears filled my eyes. "Ethan," I whispered, "is that really how you see me?" He looked at me with a seriousness that made my chest tighten. "Mom, that's who you are. You just don't see it anymore." It was such a simple statement, yet it pierced me deeper than anything Michael had said in years. I realized then how starved I had been for affirmation, for someone to remind me that I was more than just the roles I filled. But with that realization came something darker, because once you feel seen in a way you've been longing for, it's hard to step back into the shadows of neglect. I began to crave our sessions, not just for the art, but for the attention, the intimacy of being studied and appreciated. And though Ethan's intentions were pure, my own heart began to wander into dangerous territory. I didn't set out to betray my husband. I didn't wake up one morning and decide to let my emotions slip beyond the boundaries of family. But life rarely works in sharp lines. It blurs, it softens, it tempts. And soon I found myself confiding in Ethan about things I had never voiced aloud. My loneliness, my fears of getting older, my frustration with Michael's distance. Ethan listened with compassion, never judgment, and that alone felt like a lifeline. One evening, Michael came home earlier than usual. He walked into the garage, just as Ethan was finishing a sketch, and he froze when he saw us. Not because we were doing anything inappropriate. We weren't. But because of the intensity in the air. He looked from me to the canvas, and then back at me, and I saw suspicion flicker in his eyes. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice sharp. I stumbled over my words, explaining about the project, about how it was purely artistic. Ethan backed me up, showing him the assignment details. Michael nodded, but his jaw was tight, and I knew he wasn't convinced. From that night on, something shifted in our marriage. He grew more distant, more irritable, as though he sensed that part of me had drifted away, even if he didn't know exactly where. And he was right, because as much as I tried to deny it, I had crossed an invisible line, not physically, but emotionally. I had invested pieces of my heart where they didn't belong, and the guilt nodded at me, even as I returned to that chair day after day, unable to let go of the comfort it gave me. What happened next was something none of us expected.